Welcome to another STARS webinar. I am David Orn, Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. We have over 100 participants joining today's webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we talk with Professor Dr. HUANG Jing about what exactly the US and China are competing over, what it means for each side to win, and whether this competition is at all possible without ending in catastrophe. Jing is Dean of the Institute of International and Regional Studies at Beijing Language and Culture University. He is also Chief Strategist and Vice Chairman of Grandview Institution, an independent foreign policy think tank based in Beijing. From 2008 to 2018, Jing was Lee Foundation Professor on US-China relations and Director of the Center on Asia and Globalization at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He previously served as Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, as Shorenstein Fellow at Stanford University, and as Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Asian Studies Program at Utah State University. Jing earned a bachelor's degree in English literature from Sichuan University, a master's degree in history from Fudan University, and a PhD in political science from Harvard. Last but not least, Jing is also a member of the STARS Scientific Board, and he is based in Beijing. Good afternoon to you, Jing. Good to see you, and thank you for speaking in today's webinar.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for nice introductions. Great to see you and see other friends here, and to share my views on the issues with all of you.
We now have 30 minutes to discuss with Jing. I will take the privilege to ask the first couple of questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Jing, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. Tensions between the US and China have escalated significantly over the past 3 years, and today mutual distrust is at an all-time high. What do you see as the sources of these tensions, and what exactly are the US and China competing over?
Yeah, to see the source or the fundamental source of the US-China competition, I have to understand how China has been rising to the #2 power and #1 trading power on Earth. I think China's rise is achieved by joining or integrating itself in the existing international order, which was established, maintained, and led by United States and its allies after 1945. As China getting bigger and bigger in the system, in the so-called established world, China's political system and the values behind it become more and more, become more and more obvious and problematic. The China's political system, the value behind it, is not compatible with the political mainstream of this international order in which China is part of it. So this incompatibility between China's political system and the mainstream of this international order, in my view, is an essential source for all the problems China has encountered in dealing with the world. And people are going to argue that why, and like Chinese leaders used to argue, we can peacefully coexist. In other words, China will continue its political system called socialism under the leadership of Chinese Communist Party, so-called Beijing consensus, and then coexist peacefully with Washington consensus. But the matter is not that simple. I think we know that a fundamental dilemma, or Chinese term, a fundamental contradiction that we human beings always have since day one, is that we have unlimited demand or desire against very limited resources. So fundamentally speaking, whatever system we have, it's to solve the problem of distribution. That is how we're going to distribute the very limited resources we have. So different ways of life gave us different solutions or different way of distribution. That's why it matters, because in a system where the leaders or so-called leaders determines what we can have what we can have not determines how we are going to distribute our very limited resources, are fundamentally different from society where we the people determines how we're going to do that. So that's where I think the source of this competition between United States and China really is. It is a computation of the way of life.
Now that you have set the scene, I would like to bring in our audience with a quick anonymous poll with 2 questions. All participants should now see the 2 questions on their screen. The first question is, what is your outlook on bilateral relations between the US and China for 2021? Will relations improve, stay about the same, or deteriorate? Please cast your vote now. And the second question is, would you expect a Biden victory to improve US-China relations? Let us know what you think, and in a minute we'll get Jing to comment. Let's close this poll and have a look at the results. So 16% said that they expect US-China relations to improve in 2021. 47% think they will stay about the same, and 38% expect them to deteriorate. As for the second question, we have a 50-50 split. Jing, if you can comment on these results, what is your view? What dynamic do you expect in US-China relations for next year, and will the results of the US presidential election make any difference?
I think overall it will remain the same, because this kind of competition between China and the United States has become norm. What I'm trying to say is that it doesn't matter who wins the White House. This strategic consensus in the United States has been achieved, which that is, you have to stop China by, try to carry on the entire world the Chinese way. The only differences, if there will be, let's go to second question, that is Joe Biden win the victory. The only difference is this. And in my view, President Donald Trump, the biggest damage President Donald Trump has done to the United States and to all of us is that he's an unpredictable guy. He's quite uncertain. When the most powerful leader on earth changes his mind and his action and what he said constantly, we all get lost, number one. Number two, of course, United States' strength is not just because United States of America is the number one power on earth. It's because United States of America has played a role of leadership of the established world. That's where the strength really is. But what President Donald Trump has damaged so badly is the leadership United States of America is playing. That's why in the so-called competition between China and the United States, China is trying to play the so-called multilateralism, the card of multilateralism, in order to prevent the major allies of the United States and other major powers by standing by the US side. And they have been quite successful. I think China has been very wise and successful in this regard. That is why the unilateralism under the so-called banner America First of Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, is not entirely unwelcome in Beijing. So if Joe Biden came to power, the differences is this. US-China relations overall will not improve. The competition will continue. But I would argue that President Joe Biden, if he is the president, will try to restore US leadership first by get Europe, Japan, and all the major countries, especially the established world, the advanced countries, developed countries, because each one of them is democracy. All of them unite together and then put pressure on China. So in the short run, China will feel US-China relationship may be stable because on several issues, China and the United States can work together and should work together. That is, for example, on the environmental issue, on the nuclear proliferation issue, and on anti-terrorism issue. And also another thing is that I think President Joe Biden, if elected, will go back to multilateral approach rather than unilateral approach. And this also seems China and United States have some common ground. But eventually, China will feel pressure because now it's not just United States, an uncertain United States under the leadership of uncertain Donald Trump that is fight China. This will be a quite stable, even predictable United States, together with its major allies and other major powers, to put pressure on China, to give China two tools. Number one, China continues its reform in real meaning, and so that China will move towards the right direction. The other way, of course, China will face another outcome that is China will be truly so-called decoupled. And I hope so. The good news is that we're going to see a quite stable relationship between United States and China, even though this relationship nowadays is marked by this word called competition. And the bad news, the bad news for Chinese leaders or China and others is that the pressure will be much more organized, united, and of course, predictable. So that would be a long run competition between the two major powers. But to the rest of the world, this competition is predictable, is manageable, and I also believe it's less dangerous because the possibility to get into what I call accidental clash between two major powers will be much, much lower than under the leadership of President Donald Trump.
You already talked about US long-term strategy towards China, and you mentioned that to be successful, that strategy has to have a much larger multilateral component. So let's look at the Chinese perspective. Xi Jinping must currently feel pretty confident in his choices about political and economic governance, as it seems his authoritarian leadership is working pretty well for him. When it comes to doing things like adopting the national security law in Hong Kong, for instance, it seems that China can get away with it with very minimal pushback. So the question is, what lessons does Xi Jinping draw from that? And what does it mean for China's long-term strategy towards the US?
I think first and foremost, I have to say that China, even under the single party rule, is never united, just like the United States has a lot of differences. In China, one consequence, which in my view is irrevocable consequence of reform, is that China as a society, as a nation, is highly diversified in terms of demand and interest on any major issues, including Hong Kong, you just mentioned. We have different opinions, different interests involved, and therefore different demand. And as a result, it's quite ironically, in a situation like this, given the nature, the very nature of China's political system, in a situation like this, when the leadership in Beijing behave quite hardline, quite hawkish, quite tough, usually it tells that internal situation is not that stable. In other words, if the leader of China is confident, have since managed the way he wants, in other words, have since under control and his confidence about the political stability and development in China, he could be more compromising, more so-called soft or moderate. It is the internal situation that becomes more challenge to him, the more difficult for him to manage the situation at home. Then he have no choice but appear to be more tough, hawkish. So you just asked me about the lessons the President Xi Jinping has learned. I think there's three. It's number one, that the way the Chinese leadership is doing its so-called business or practice leadership is fundamentally different from the way the international system, the so-called world, can appreciate. In other words, as China getting stronger and stronger, like I said, let me repeat myself, the incompatibility of China's value, so-called the values of Chinese leaders or Chinese political systems, is become more and more obvious, and you just cannot push through. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, try to, to leverage the external conflict to handle internal problems. Sometimes works, but not work in the long run. It will backfire because his opponents will use the difficulties he has encountered in international affairs, in foreign affairs, to strengthen themselves. So therefore, to put up an even stronger and more effective resistance to the policies he wants to carry on. Last but not the least, of course, China is very much connected to the world. It's irrevocable because as a number one trading power, if the whole world has a negative view or negative attitude towards China, then China cannot do very well. And he has to understand. That's why if we observe what's happening in Beijing the past few months, we can see a very subtle but very meaningful change. That is, the Chinese leadership has been softened a bit, especially in terms of foreign policies. And they no longer talk about so-called Chinese way or Chinese solution or so-called major power diplomacy, 大国外交, and they emphasize that One Belt, One Road is just an initiative, it's not a strategy, and so on and so forth. Especially Wang's recent speech and the Fu Ying's recent speech, you can see that they try to, compromise. But whether they can, achieve what they desire, that's another story. But again, I think that appearing tough, hardline, does not mean the Chinese leader has things under control at home. It is otherwise more often than not.
Let's again bring in our audience with a live poll. The question is, will the US and China go from cold to hot war in the next 5 years? Please let us know whether you think that is not likely, somewhat likely, or very likely. Please cast your vote now, and then we'll get Jing to share his view. Okay, let's close the poll and have a quick look at the results. 60% said that the US and China going from cold to hot war in the next 5 years is not likely. 35% think it is somewhat likely, and only 5% see it as very likely. Jing, what is your view? How likely is it that they will engage in a hot war?
I agree with the majority. I don't think that US and China get into hot war is likely. I think the chance is very low, unless, of course, if President Donald Trump win another term. I cannot, I don't know, because the mid-name of President Donald Trump is uncertainty and unpredictable. That's his middle name. But even if, I hope this will not happen, even if he does win the second term, I believe the American institutions is strong enough to put some brick on him, to constrain him, that he would not do a crazy thing. For the Chinese leadership, of course, it's the last thing they want is to confront the mighty United States. It's not just because United States is so strong, but because if China want to continue its rise, if sustain its development, China does need a peaceful environment, external environment, because that's a necessary condition for China to continue this growth. And I think no one knows this better than Chinese leaders themselves.
I'd like to run a third and final poll among our audience. The question is, what do you worry about most that could escalate US-China tensions? Is it security? For instance, some incident in the South China Sea or around Taiwan? Is it trade? For instance, more tariffs? Is it technology? Think of the Huawei and TikTok bans, for instance. Is it in the field of finance? For instance, with the US weaponizing the dollar, Or do you see the biggest risks in an ideological struggle around, let's say, human rights? Please cast your vote now, and then we'll get Jing to share his view. Okay, let's close the poll and have a look at the results. I leave the results on the screen and ask you, Jing, what do you worry about most that could escalate US-China tensions? What keeps you awake at night?
I would agree with the majority again here. It's ideology, because just as I said at the very beginning, it's a way of life that matters to all of us. And China represents a way of life that is not acceptable by the established world, number one. And number two, if United States want to mobilize the international forces to form what the Chinese called a united front vis-a-vis China, then United States, no matter who is the president in the White House, will have to emphasize the ideological difference between the Washington consensus and the Beijing consensus. So that's why ideology could be a very important issue in the US-China competition. And from China's side, of course, if we observe Beijing's behavior in the past few months, we can say that China has obviously watered down the ideological issues. China tried to emphasize on common interests like before, which in my view is not a bad thing, it's a good news, because if China really do sense more practical emphasis on common interests and not to insist on the ideological so-called lines in its policy internally and externally, eventually, I think the majority of Chinese people, the people who has begun to enjoy modern life, will understand that the kind of ideology the party has emphasized in the past few years does not help China. But of course, we need patience. And another issue I think can really bring about escalation is, in my view, South China Sea. In other words, United States policy actually is quite conservative, even though it appears very aggressive. That is, let's maintain status quo. Status quo has three elements in it. Number one, of course, is the freedom of navigation. And from China's point of view, this is a freedom of navigation for the American military's freedom. But that's fine, because after 1945, United States really is the one that delivers peace and stability in the region. Freedom of navigation of US military doesn't mean that China's freedom of navigation will be constrained. So that's first. And second, of course, on the territory dispute in South China Sea, if we cannot solve it, let's stop the kind of behavior that makes sense even worse. In other words, from US point of view, let's stop the man-made islands. But from China's point of view, of course, status quo means United States not to intervene. And the third element in it is that we do not use force to solve any dispute, especially China. So if you can remain the three elements, we remain like what I just described. South China Sea, we can manage a kind of peace and stability that will serve everybody's interest. But of course, as China getting bigger and bigger, stronger, there is a very strong push in China, especially by those nationalistic elements. Strong push in China that South China Sea belongs to China. And if China continued to move into that direction, and the United States may be forced to take some actions that will, lead to a kind of clash that nobody wants to say. So therefore, it is South China Sea that I think could be very dangerous in terms that both China and the United States see South China Sea as a point, as a high ground they have to occupy, because whoever, appears soft on this issue will mean that the strategic balance will shift towards the opponent's advantage. So that is a competition between the United States and China, so have some real security significance there. Because for the Chinese, the bottom line is that South China Sea doesn't just matter for China's economic development. It matters for China's national identity, national security, and of course, also matters about Chinese leadership stability. In other words, no Chinese leaders can afford to appear soft in South China Sea. But for the United States, of course, it also matters United States national security, and also matters United States commitment as a leader of the world, and also matters about United States fundamental interest. Can you imagine if the United States, just watered down or cave in even the South China Sea issue? The entire neighborhood, all the countries in Asian Pacific will have Plan B, and that's I do not believe the United States can afford to lose that, to let those countries as Plan B. So as a result, even though security is not the kind of top issue just in your poll, I still believe security issue has some real elements in it. And South China Sea is so-called a testing ground for this.
The final question for today comes from Bruno Gehrig. He's a board member of Merki Baumann and former chairman of Swiss and Swiss Life and former board member of Roche, UBS, and the Swiss National Bank. His question is about the Chinese currency. Do you think that the renminbi will develop into a main currency of the world?
Eventually it will, because as a #1 trading power on earth, and renminbi or financial system of China has to open up. Otherwise, it has become more and more a bottleneck for China's development. But how to do that? It will take some time. First and foremost, of course, China and the United States will have to reach terms, have to get in some terms that, in other words, relationship of renminbi and US dollars has to be negotiated so that we will not see a kind of the regime change, financial regime change, that will only bring us to disaster. And secondly, Chinese economy has to be really open, not like the half door closed. In other words, China has to follow the rule of game in doing business with others. I can hardly see that the world will let renminbi becomes international currency. I can hardly say that China will be able to truly open up the financial system if China's some economic policies is not changed for better. Last but not the least, of course, let's do not forget euro. And we have actually two open currencies that has a global impact. One is American dollars, another is euro. But euro has euro's weakness because euro is not a current sovereign currency. It cannot and does not serve any policy purposes, not like RMB and American dollars. So how those currencies can work together, I think that requires a lot of cooperation, coordination. And so the open up, let me conclude this, the open up RMB determines on three factors. Like number one, if Chinese economy can continue to develop in the right direction, that is how open Chinese economy would be, and we continue to move forward. And number two, it depends on the US-China relationship, especially in terms of finance. Number three also determines on the role the euro is going to play in all of this. It's complicated, but in the long run, I think it will be. But it could be, in my view, more complicated and difficult than it appears.
With that, I would like to thank you very much, Jing, for your time and for sharing your perspective with us. Thank you, Jing.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank all our alumni who participated in this webinar. And thank you for tuning in. Stay healthy and stay connected. Thank you and goodbye.
Okay, take care. Take care.